Good morning. Welcome to Hudson Institute. Those of you who have joined us in person, it's a pleasure to host you, and those of you who are joining us online, thank you so much for your time. I'm Rebecca Heinrichs, and I'm the director of the Keystone Defense Initiative here at Hudson. We are in a new era of nuclear dangers. China is undertaking an unprecedented strategic nuclear breakout and refuses to engage in productive discussions about its nuclear intentions. Russia has invested in new and novel nuclear weapons and continues to engage in nuclear brinksmanship while launching a war of aggression against Ukraine. And Russia and China are increasingly collaborating. Policymakers and strategists must grapple with this new reality and with a sense of urgency. And if you've studied nuclear deterrence over the last 40 years, you are familiar with Dr. Keith Payne. And if you are not, I am sorry to tell you, you've been reading the wrong books. Keith is one of the most significant American intellectuals today. And now that may seem like hyperbole, but when you consider what he has dedicated his intellect and efforts to, and his influence, I hope you'll see it's not. He has served in various capacities within the Department of Defense, shaping U.S. nuclear deterrence strategy, often behind the scenes, but careful readers of the country's nuclear posture reviews and other documents can see his fingerprints. He was also notably a commissioner on the 2008-2009 Bipartisan Congressional Commission on the U.S. Strategic Posture. And he hasn't been content to merely shape policy and strategy documents. His prolific scholarship shapes the expert community's discussions and provokes new, fresh thinking. He has done this as the president and co-founder of the National Institute for Public Policy. And he is the co-author or editor of, I think it's more than 40 published books at this point, but that was the number in the bio. He's also a professor and the former department head of the Graduate Department of Defense and Strategic Studies program at the Missouri State University, which I am proud to have graduated from under his guidance and teaching. He has taught hundreds of Americans how to analyze carefully and interrogate assumptions in deterrence theory and practice and provide usable, practical solutions to policymakers. It is a privilege to host him here today and to hear him lead us through the findings and recommendations of his latest project. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Payne.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that nice introduction. I appreciate it. It's great to be back at Hudson Institute, where I started my professional career 47 years ago, working for Colin Gray and Herman Kahn. And I don't often do public presentations, but when Rebecca invited me, it was on behalf of the Hudson Institute, I couldn't say no. I'd like to start by noting that for decades, every new presidential administration has sought to put its mark on nuclear policy, nuclear deterrence policies. New administrations like to give new names to their policies to suggest that they've come up with something different, when in reality, there's really been very little truly new in the world of deterrence for decades. Continuity is the real hallmark of U.S. nuclear deterrence policy, even as the world changes. Continuity is the hallmark of our policy. So in anticipation of a new administration coming into office in 2025, some colleagues and I decided in late 2024 to begin a new deterrence review study. Now, in 2023, the Strategic Posture Commission, which Rebecca was a member of, provided an outstanding report. With the new study that we were intent on beginning, we hope to add to the Strategic Posture Review's report, if we could, and then comment on anything new since that report was written. Our new study was published in June of 2025 under the title, A New Strategic Review for a New Year, 2025, and it's available without charge. Our goal was to produce and distribute a new review with conclusions that might help inform a new administration and a new Congress with regard to the sharply worsening nuclear threat environment, and to identify some possible U.S. options for responding to this very much changed for the bad, for the worse, I guess I should say, threat environment. The expert contributors to our study included General Kevin Chilton, Michaela Dodge, Robert Joseph, Mitch Kugler, Frank Miller, Admiral Charles Richard, Tom Schieber, Mark Schneider, and David Trachtenberg, all experts with many, many years in the field. So I'd like to take just a few minutes to provide a brief overview of our main conclusions. But my main focus today isn't necessarily going to be on the conclusions of the study in detail. What I'd like to look at is the factors that have put us where we are today in an unprecedented threat position. You might ask, why look back? I think we need to look back as to how we got here, because we first need to recognize the hole that we are in and stop digging it. And the contemporary plans for U.S. nuclear force modernization and the New START Treaty were established in tandem approximately 15 years ago. That was at a time when U.S. officials generally still believed that relations with Russia and China were relatively benign, and that, in fact, they would improve further. The only remaining threats were a small number of third-tier rogue states and terrorists. Nuclear weapons were considered irrelevant to these remaining threats. Consequently, many American officials considered the need for nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence to be a thing of the past, and the need for them to be greatly diminished or non-existent. The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, for example, explicitly said that the #1 priority goal was nonproliferation, not nuclear deterrence. Well, that may not sound like much of a change, but the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review said rightly, for the first time, nonproliferation is the priority goal. The reason why that was important, because the key to nonproliferation, at least at the time, was thought that the U.S. should pull back from its nuclear forces to reduce the role and number of U.S. nuclear forces. So nonproliferation and U.S. reduction in forces and the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. policy went hand in hand. So reducing the role and number of U.S. nuclear weapons was considered a key to this priority goal of nonproliferation. My former Hudson Institute colleague, Paul Bracken, said of the time, and I quote, "All were on board to oppose nuclear arms. Academics, think tanks, and intellectuals quickly jumped on the bandwagon." Close quote. The hubris of the time reflected what I consider to be a gross misreading of history. In addition, Washington continued to enjoy the post-Cold War peace dividend, and in 2001 gave up maintaining a two-war standard for non-nuclear force preparedness. In fact, only 1 year before Russia initially attacked Ukraine in 2014, the United States was still withdrawing heavy tanks from Europe. American leaders at the time expressed shock at this aggressive Russian behavior, its initial attacks on Ukraine. Why? Because those attacks contradicted the celebrated narrative that great power conflict was a thing of the past. It wasn't supposed to happen anymore. History was supposed to have transcended those old school realities and hostilities. Secretary of State Kerry said Russia's 2014 aggression sprang not from expansionist aggressive intent, but from its feelings of weakness. You see, Russia was more pathetic and unsophisticated than aggressive and expansionist. Secretary Kerry added, and I quote, you just don't, in the 21st century, behave in a 19th century fashion. That was supposed to be the new world order reality. As an astute academic commentator noted recently, and I quote, such expectations reflected ideological certitude bordering on geostrategic arrogance. one that still infuses the nation's policy debates. Not everyone was so optimistic in the early days after the Cold War. My colleague Colin Gray, for example, disputed such naive thoughts at the time. He said early in the post-Cold War period that we were in only a short pause of great power hostilities, and that, and I quote, another bloody century would resume. In fact, he titled one of his books, Another Bloody Century. In fact, Colin dismissed then prevalent expectations of a cooperative new world order and pointed to, and I quote, the strong possibility that world politics 2 to 3 decades hence will be increasingly organized around the rival poles of US and Chinese power. And that at that time, he projected China would menace Japan. He was also fully expected that Russia would again confront the West militarily and, I quote, immediately confront and threaten independent Ukraine. Unfortunately, as Colin expected, the post-Cold War superficial tranquility with its short-lived burst of optimism was but a brief interlude before a return to sharp hostilities and conflict. Nevertheless, Western officials on a bipartisan basis welcomed the largely academic trope that the bad old history was over and that great power military conflict and nuclear weapons were things of the past. A new world order was at hand, and we could now generally forget old fears, particularly those old fears that drove any need for nuclear weapons. Instead, we could enjoy a well-deserved peace dividend and continue to enjoy it. Now, that hapless interpretation of 21st century international relations was the backdrop for New START and the current U.S. strategic nuclear program. That program reflects a continuation of what former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates has called America's 3-decade-long holiday from history. It was consciously structured to comport with significant reductions of the U.S. nuclear force structure under the New START Treaty and not add new capabilities. And Washington continues to adhere to this framework, while Russia and China have engaged in unprecedented nuclear and conventional force expansion, in parallel with their increasingly aggressive foreign policy agendas. Indeed, Russia has so blatantly violated the New START Treaty that we are unlikely to know Russian strategic nuclear force numbers at this point. Russia shut down on-site inspections years ago. Why is that important? It's important because at the time of the hearings for New START, these inspections were celebrated as the means of having transparency into force numbers. Thanks to Moscow, that transparency has been gone for years. And with breathtaking hypocrisy and chutzpah, after years of New START violations, likely including exceeding warhead limits, Putin has now offered to extend observance another year. Perhaps more importantly, both Russia and China see nuclear weapons not simply as tools for deterrence, defensive deterrence, as we in the West tend to understand the value of nuclear weapons and deterrence. They've deployed nuclear weapons not only to deter U.S. attacks, although folks who want to rationalize Russian and Chinese behavior tend to make that claim. Moscow and Beijing also value nuclear weapons for the coercive cover they can provide for aggressive expansionism. The basic notion in this regard is not complex. If they can paralyze the West with various types of nuclear threats, they'll have a relatively free hand to act aggressively at the time and place of their choosing. This is aggression backed by nuclear coercion. It's a difference between a nuclear posture that says, if you attack, I will escalate, and a nuclear coercive posture that says, if you respond to my escalation, or excuse me, if you respond to my aggression, then I'll escalate. The difference in words here is minimal. The difference in intention is enormous. We've seen this coercive nuclear formula play out in Europe since 2022 as Russia makes more and more explicit nuclear threats, seemingly sort of every Tuesday and Thursday. And we may see it play out again in Taiwan, and possibly the near future. In fact, we may confront coordinated Russian and Chinese aggression under the cover of coercive nuclear threats. A primary goal of U.S. nuclear deterrence has been to prevent coercive threats. And yet we see them now routinely. To date, our ability to deter coercive threats and to convince threatened allies that we can do so has been a mixed bag. As a consequence, increasingly fearful allies now have open discussions of independent nuclear capabilities, including in South Korea, where the last poll I saw suggested that a large percentage of the population supports independent South Korean nuclear weapons, but also in Japan, Germany, and to some extent even in Australia. If this trend continues and is magnified, nuclear proliferation will be unleashed, not because the United States maintained nuclear deterrence, as was earlier the contention. Nuclear proliferation will be unleashed because the United States has not sustained a credible extended deterrent. Unfortunately, history has given us a nuclear threat environment that's much more dangerous than we expected in 2010. The likely inadequacies of U.S. nuclear forces in this environment are the direct result of opponents who have aggressive agendas, and their military buildups correspond to those aggressive agendas. We've also contributed to the situation we're in with our own naive initiatives and behavior. Washington's mistakes in this regard seem to get a pass as a prime contributor to where we are now, and saying that we are at least partially responsible is painful, but not saying so is a mistake because it encourages repetition. Keep digging the hole we're in. It would be wise to recognize Washington's past arms control mistakes so that we just might not repeat them in the future, particularly as President Putin has put out this offer. Let me give you an example. President George H.W. Bush had a celebrated called the PNIs in 1991, Presidential Nuclear Initiative, which were really a reflection of a very naive set of expectations about Russia. And those PNIs, Presidential Nuclear Initiatives, have created an enormous asymmetry in nuclear threat capabilities and contributed to the fragility of our current extended deterrence position. To expect arms control agreements to solve our problems now would be comparably naive. But regardless of how we got here, we are where we are. And the immediate question before us is whether the Trump administration will now adjust the current nuclear modernization program to fit the reality of an unexpectedly dangerous threat environment. Washington essentially has three options. Theoretically, has three options in this regard. One, it can define down the necessary requirements for deterrence and happily announce that the current modernization program is adequate or much more than enough. This is the less is enough approach that is now advocated by some prominent commentators. I call this the minimum deterrence school solution. Or two, Washington can maintain its longstanding definition of deterrence adequacy and hope against hope that deterrence simply isn't tested, while we await the replacement systems coming online. This is the do nothing new path preferred by many in the hope that the apparent threats either are not real or will somehow go away. I call this hope is our strategy school solution. Or 3, Washington can move forward urgently to strengthen the U.S. nuclear deterrence position. This is the do more now approach suggested by the 2023 Nuclear Posture Commission. I call this a honest threat-based school solution, a threat-based school solution. And our recently released study concludes that this third option is the most prudent. Why? Well, because of Chinese, Russian, North Korean goals and their posturing for over a decade. Now, neither of the first 2 options that I mentioned, the minimum deterrence or hope is our strategy, neither of those options really acknowledges that the increased threat environment over the past decade has affected U.S. nuclear deterrence requirements. But as Winston Churchill said, it is necessary sometimes to take the enemy into consideration. And Churchill's wise advice suggests that, given the heightened threat context, Washington's most obvious course, prudent course, is to strengthen the U.S. deterrent posture for itself and for its allies. The 2013 Strategic Posture Commission report used the word urgent or urgently over 40 times. Many of our allies have slowly and grudgingly come to the same conclusion. Unfortunately, for the past 4 decades, the U.S. has engaged in deep strategic and non-strategic nuclear force reduction and allowed the atrophying of the U.S. nuclear force infrastructure. So the United States is largely limited by the existing number of available platforms, bombers, missiles, and the number of available warheads in the near term to strengthen its nuclear force posture. Today, the United States reportedly has approximately 1,660 deployed strategic nuclear weapons. Those are above the start limits only because of the easy counting rules for bomber weapons, not because the United States has exceeded those. And with this level of capacity, even with the planned U.S. force replacement program, the United States likely cannot fully or simultaneously hold at risk Russian and Chinese targets related to deterrence, particularly given Beijing's new nuclear force expansion and its breathtaking construction of underground facilities. So where does that put us? In a sense, nuclear force upload, that is adding existing weapons to existing platforms, is a timely, likely low-cost option for strengthening deterrence in the near term as we await the results of the Strategic Modernization Program. In fact, nuclear upload is likely the only way America can adequately enhance the strategic nuclear force size and needed flexibility to tailor deterrence in the near term, given the realities that we now confront. The entire U.S. nuclear triad likely could be uploaded before the first elements of the planned nuclear modernization program becomes operational. Now, let me add that upload, as I've described it, is not a substitute for the nuclear modernization program because the existing triad is aging out rapidly. But it may be critical for deterrence in the near term. Upload, even under the limits of New START, could provide approximately 2,200 warheads. As I said, that number is possible because of New START's fairly loose bomber counting rules. If not constrained under New START, the United States could have deployed a strategic ballistic missile force of approximately 2,600 weapons, depending on decisions with regard to missile range and other operational considerations. Bomber weapons could add somewhat to that number via uploading. And the follow-on systems could be uploaded to these higher numbers. The cost of upload is likely to be quite modest, largely for transportation and warhead installation. An August 2020 report from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, concluded that one, expanding nuclear forces to the Moscow Treaty limit, that's 2,200 warheads, would, quote, not increase the Department of Defense's costs relative to its current plans. And two, quote, increasing warhead loadings to reach START 2 limits, that would have been 3,500 warheads, would incur about $100 million in one-time costs for DoD. Now, those numbers don't take the inflation factor into account since 2020, but in the realm we're talking about, that is relatively low cost, very low cost. So in some, nuclear weapons upload of legacy and eventually replacement forces is, we concluded, a near-term and likely low-cost option. To do otherwise will be to risk that the planned nuclear force modernization program will be too slow and too limited to provide confident deterrence and extended deterrence in what is a rapidly worsening nuclear threat environment. So you might ask, what about arms control in this context? Some former U.S. officials continue to claim that arms control can solve or help solve the current threat challenges, and that specifically an agreement against uploading is now the top priority. So let me summarize that. Our conclusion was, if we want near-term capability, we need to upload. Folks who have proposed arms control limits now say, what we need to do is prevent uploading. You see, there's some conflict there. That's no surprise that these new suggestions against uploading have come about, particularly now that Putin has suggested extending the observance of New START. It's not surprised. We as Americans typically want to solve nuclear threat problems via arms control. Why is that? Well, I'm not sure. It's a cultural tendency, I'm sure of that. I tend to think it's because we like to see technical and contractual solutions to political problems. Because this ultimately is a political problem, international politics. We like technical, contractual solutions. Why? Because political solutions are really difficult, really difficult. Technical, contractual solutions kind of go with our ethos. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are not interested in what we call stability. They seek a new world order at the expense of the United States and our allies. And as long as these authoritarian regimes continue to view the United States and our allies as the impediment to their drive to reorganize the world order, it simply now is naive to expect them to accept meaningful limitations on the military means that are the basis for their drive to reorganize the globe. Again, going back to Colin Gray's work, which is appropriate here at Hudson Institute because he was here at Hudson Institute with Herman Kahn. Going back to Colin Gray's work, he said, after studying arms control history, he provided years ago this famous pithy conclusion that meaningful arms control is either, quote, impossible or unimportant. What did he mean by that? What he meant is that truly useful arms control with dedicated enemies is impossible. And with dedicated friends, it's unimportant. I believe that conclusion fully applies to today vis-a-vis China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Expecting otherwise will likely be the basis for another costly mistake. What about missile defense in this context? For deterrence. For deterrence, missile defense is no substitute for offensive capabilities that can hold at risk what opponents value. So what I'm not saying is missile defense is the solution for our deterrence problems, but missile defense can complement those capabilities that we rely on for deterrence. Moving now progressively to protect U.S. nuclear retaliatory capabilities, including nuclear command, control, and communications, I believe is an urgent priority. The more effectively the United States provides this protection, the more able it will be to deter war. There are no trade-offs in that regard. Now, critics of homeland missile defense now repeat the same arguments that I have literally heard since the 1960s. One, homeland defense can't work. Can't work. Two, homeland defense will destabilize deterrence. It's bad for deterrence. Inconsistent with deterrence. And three, homeland defense will lead our opponents to arms racing that they otherwise wouldn't do. These three arguments have driven U.S. missile defense policy for decades. But for all their repetition and policy influence, these arguments are either demonstrably bogus or they're logically incoherent at this point in this contemporary threat context. Let me take them sequentially. One, homeland defense likely cannot be 100% effective against a large-scale nuclear attack. But that's a standard of will it work put forth as a straw man by opponents of missile defense. Homeland defense that is far from perfect can work in extremely helpful ways for deterrence and if deterrence fails. Two, rather than destabilizing deterrence, U.S. homeland defense will more likely strengthen deterrence in many plausible scenarios, and I think the most plausible scenarios. We tend to forget, but it's a truism, that it's the presence of our nuclear retaliatory and defensive capabilities that created needed deterrence effect. It's not the absence of our defenses that create deterrent effect. And third, our opponents have been arms racing for well over a decade. U.S. homeland defense now is hardly going to be the cause of their arms racing. Let me conclude by saying that we and our allies are in an unprecedentedly precarious place. International political hostilities are now as ripe as they were prior to World War II. With one substantive difference, the instruments of destruction now are much more lethal than they were at that time. And they're in the hands of many. The great Australian scholar Hedley Bull described a leadership tendency that well described how we got here. I said we were at least partially responsible for digging the hole we're in. Hedley Bull said, and I quote, "History is littered with catastrophe, unthinkable and unimaginable to its victims, who placed their trust in a logic of history that deserted them in their hour of need." Much of Washington has misread history for the past 3 decades to our great contemporary disadvantage and to the fragility of our deterrence position, our ability to prevent war. Recognizing where we are, how we got here, and trying to move quickly to strengthen our position may yet help deter war. In saying this, I don't expect Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran to soon give up their drive to overturn the world order at our expense. If they did, that would be the political solution. I don't expect them to give up their drive. Until they do, it's my hope that U.S. and allied deterrence positions will compel them to wake up every morning and conclude, not today, not today. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I believe we are going to do some questions and answers. Great, thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Keith. I'm going to jump right in here, and I want to talk about the New START treaty. It seems like during the first Trump administration, President Trump understood that the INF treaty was restraining the United States while the Russians were cheating on it, and at the same time, the Chinese were not restrained by it because they were never party to it, and they had built an entire arsenal of ranges of weapons and types of weapons that would have been in violation of the INF treaty. So President Trump at the time said, we're not going to be party to that treaty. It seems to me like the same logic applies for New START. And it sounds like that's what you're arguing for in the report. I'm sure there's differences, but is that basically a good parallel?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The INF Treaty, in conjunction with the P&Is that I mentioned earlier, basically have left the United States and allies in a very weak position with regard to extended deterrence. Deterrence, I believe, for our allies in Asia and Europe. And that's an example of what happened with regard to those arms control initiatives and what they did. The New START Treaty, in turn, has put ceilings on our platforms and on our warheads that may have been appropriate as we thought the world existed in 2010 and as we thought history would unfold. History has unfolded in a very different direction, and I don't say that with any satisfaction, even if Colin Gray, my colleague, predicted that. We're in a much more difficult position now than we were circa 2010. And so the limits that New START puts on the United States with regard to forces, both platforms and warheads, one, it prevents upload beyond, as I said, about 2,200 weapons. As you say, well, what difference does that make? Well, if you think about the expansion of Chinese systems, the expansion of Russian nuclear systems, the breathtaking underground work that China has done, you have to ask yourself, if the number of weapons were fully committed for deterrence purposes in 2010, where are we now? Do we still have an adequate deterrent if that was your definition of adequacy back in 2010 or so? My suggestion is no, probably not. And we need to expand our forces to have a flexible, tailored deterrent for the looming period that we're entering into. And to do that, in my mind, we have to get beyond start limits on both launcher numbers and warheads. We can choose not to do that, but if we choose not to do that, again, we're running the risk that our deterrent that we thought was adequate in 2010, running the risk that it will not be adequate in the years to come.
One of the things I appreciate about how you wrote this is we did this similar thing in the 2023 Strategic Posture Commission, where we try to anticipate some of what people who are biased against investing in nuclear deterrence. They don't want to do it for whatever reason, maybe for stability reasons in their mind or just for cost or whatever, but they're looking for a reason to grab onto to not spend money on nuclear deterrence. And so we had to sort of preempt that and say, this is not what we're talking about. And you did that too. You know, you say, we have to have Sentinel. Like we have to have the program of record that was developed still must be modernized. We have to continue to do that. At the same time, there are things that we should urgently do to bolster the credibility of the deterrent. So don't think that uploading is a substitute. Do not think that you can do something with Minuteman III now that would preclude your need for investing in Sentinel. And you were specific about what Sentinel provides us that we need, its accuracy and its ability to get at those deeply buried hardened targets. So just talk to us about that, because in Washington, people are looking for a quick fix that's going to be cheaper, can get the political win. You caution, that is dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with thinking that upload solves a problem for the long term is that the platforms that we're uploading are aging and aged.
Yeah.
And so we can upload, I believe, our conclusion is we can upload what we call the legacy systems, the vintage systems, for the near term, prior to the introduction of the newer systems. But if the newer systems are seen as alternatives to uploading, then we're in a pretty bad place, because those platforms that we're uploading, bombers, ICBMs, and so forth, are old systems. Some of them are many years past their initial shelf life. And the systems themselves need to be replaced. But as I said earlier, we could and should plan on uploading those systems as they come on board. In other words, upload for the vintage systems, the legacy systems, I think can help get us through the period while we're waiting for the new systems to come online, and then those systems can be uploaded as well. But if you don't have those new systems, the legacy systems that we now have are aging out fairly rapidly. The hope is that the timeline for those can be extended. We've already extended the timeline for many of them, but at some point, you simply can't extend timelines any longer. And in my mind, we are either close or past that point.
The other thing I noticed that very well argued in your report is why extended deterrence is still so important to the United States. So, and from my perspective, extended deterrence, so that the threat of one of these major nuclear powers, the threat of deterrence failure is more likely in theater against an ally, and the purpose being, it doesn't have to be a massive attack, but the purpose would be to paralyze the American people rather than enrage the American people so that we do not respond or come to the aid of allies. Can you just talk a little bit about I think especially in this political environment, people kind of think, oh, well, if it's far away, does that really affect us? Why is extended deterrence still so tied to the security of the United States?
Well, sure. I mean, the United States has global interests and global allies. We don't have global allies just for the sake of having allies. We have allies because we have global interests that allow this country to be prosperous and to operate as a democracy. The last thing we need is to be a fortress America that has to hunker down and face the rest of a hostile world. You think of what that would do to the freedoms that we have and enjoy in the United States, the prosperity that we have, it would be disastrous. So that's why the allies are extremely important. And I think our alliance commitments are extremely important. And if Rebecca, you mentioned where deterrence might be most likely to fail. Deterrence failure tend to be black swan events. They're very hard to predict. And they're usually associated with some very unique circumstances. But what you can imagine is at least a more likely event than an initial exchange of intercontinental weapons would be escalation in one of the theaters. And why do I say that? I say that because, well, Russia threatens that continually. If we do X, then they're going to resort to nuclear use. And China at least Xi has put 27 as the date he wants Chinese armed forces to be capable of taking Taiwan. And China has not ruled out the first use of nuclear weapons with regard to Taiwan. So what you see is, and if you look at Russian doctrine in particular, it seems absolutely pointed towards the threat of nuclear use or nuclear first use in a regional way or in a limited way to basically paralyze the United States from responding. So that's what I said is, it's not deterrence as we understand it, it's the coercive use of nuclear weapons, both as a threat and as a tool if necessary. And so the idea is paralyze the United States so that you have a free hand in your region. That's, it's not a shocking approach if you're looking at it from a Chinese or a Russian perspective. In fact, it's almost a self-evident approach to try and keep the US out. How? By deterring the United States from supporting its allies. And so if you think about what are let's call it the least unlikely scenarios for nuclear war, I believe that's the least unlikely scenario for nuclear war, a regional contingency where we see escalation for the purpose of keeping the United States out. And how that would what would happen after that? A lot of different possibilities, but that strikes me as the least unlikely scenario for nuclear use.
That's great. And so with that, one of the things that I've tried to sort of remind people with Russia's war against Ukraine and the constant threats from the Russians to various Russian officials or people close to the Russian government, close to Putin, when they make nuclear threats, the sort of people have asked, what's the appropriate response? And it's not to just sort of brush it off as a bluff. That would be dangerous. No, but nor is it to be sort of cowed and sort of back out and allow the Russians to kind of control events. And the response is actually, this is my favorite word in the book, if urgency was used dozens of times in the Strategic Posture Commission, I should have done a Control F to search for prudence. Prudence, the prudent response is to adapt our own forces to essentially counter-deter the Russians so that their coercive attempts don't work against us. Is that a fair way to think about it?
I mean, we can hope that Russian threats of nuclear use, regional nuclear use, are bluffs. I hope they are bluffs. But what I would ask you is, how much confidence can we have that they are entirely bluffs? I mean, Putin has said that essentially having Ukraine is essential for Russia. It's essential for the future of Russia. I don't know whether he truly believes that or whether that's sort of propaganda type talk. So, but if you think that there's a chance that Russia actually believes that it must prevail in Ukraine, that that's an existential issue for Russia, then you don't have to go very far to say, might it use theater nuclear weapons for that purpose, if it felt like it had to? I don't know what the chances are of that. Again, it's a black swan event. But the question is, do we want to run the risk that it's not a bluff and that the Russians actually believe that Ukraine is an existential need for Russia? Right? And so the question is, what do we do? Well, as I said, one of the options is to hope the threats go away, to not do anything. In my mind, that's an imprudent approach, given the potential that Russia is actually is telegraphing its views on this. So what are the options? Well, one of the option that we come to in the study and that the Strategic Posture Commission came to is, let's do what we can now to strengthen our deterrence position so that, as I said, Putin wakes up every morning and says, not today, with regard to nuclear use. So what may be appropriate for increasing our deterrence capabilities in the regions, both in Asia and in Europe? One, I think strengthening our conventional position there and our allies' conventional position is absolutely necessary. So don't think that I'm only talking nuclear. That's just not the case. But we also need to strengthen our non-strategic nuclear capabilities. Why is that? Because we want to make sure that the Russians and the Chinese, for that matter, do not believe that they can engage in limited nuclear escalation as a way of basically paralyzing the United States from supporting their allies. We want to make sure that, to the extent that we can, that the Russians and the Chinese understand the United States will support our allies if they engage in aggression against our allies. And therefore, they have to be convinced that it might not be a good idea to attack. And that's deterrence.
And then some of the specific examples, and then I'm going to just go, if we have time, just to take a couple questions from the audience. So I'm just going to make sort of this one last point. Are you okay now? We went a little bit over.
Yeah.
Okay. So SLCM-N, so that's the Sea Launched Cruise Missile Nuclear, which is something that President Trump initiated during his first administration. The Biden administration came in and said, we're not going to do it at first. And by the end of President Biden's term, they sort of realized, oh my goodness, we got to have this. And that provides us an in-theater option for that could deal with the China problem and the Russia problem. And it also has the advantage of not having to deal with sort of the challenges of basing. Although I would say that my view is that the allies have really come around given the nature of the threats, and that there is a much higher appetite in Europe, especially for making some adaptations, perhaps even in theater, to add to some deterrent options. And then the other thing is the bomber fleet, that we might need more than the 120 plus that the Air Force is planning with the next generation B-21. I know that you can't see it because it's stealthy, but I'm wearing a B-21 pin today. Here, I know it blends right in with the paint from the B-21 bomber here. But that's also important, and you talk about it here too, because of the assurances it provides. You started off your remarks talking about how the Obama administration was prioritizing non-proliferation over deterrence. And I agree with your assessment, we have to prioritize deterrence. Non-proliferation is also important, but it can complement what we do for deterrence. And actually, extended deterrence is the most effective means of non-proliferation.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
You know, I always found it curious, decades past, when the general notion was the United States has to get out of the nuclear business to promote non-proliferation. You may remember, I remember folks saying, a drunk can't promote abstinence. It was the general notion, a drunk can't promote abstinence. So what did that mean? Well, the message was the United States has to stop engaging in nuclear capabilities so that we can, from a position of ethical consistency, tell others that they shouldn't have nuclear weapons. Okay. When in fact, the most important non-proliferation tool in the world has been the U.S. extended deterrent. And so there was always this friction. As the United States decides to pull back from its nuclear capabilities, which it did, particularly its extended deterrence nuclear capabilities, as the United States pulls back from that, but wants non-proliferation to be the priority, it struck me that this was a consistency, an incoherence that was unbridgeable. For non-proliferation to continue, and I agree, I think non-proliferation is an important goal, the United States has to maintain an effective extended deterrence. And that's not just my interpretation. You basically have allies who have said, if your extended deterrence is no longer credible, then we have to do what we can on our own. Right? And that makes sense. I mean, why would that shock anybody? The only thing shocking is if the United States pulls back from its nuclear capabilities for the theater to then expect non-proliferation to result. But that's where we were. That's where we were for a long time. But as I said, I always thought that was a curious construction because it contained its own internal incoherence.
I'm going to take I'm going to bundle two questions, and we'll go here, right here in the middle. Oh goodness, there's 4 people who look so intelligent, like they have edifying questions. Let's go really quick, and I'll get them all at the same time, and then we'll let Keith and I kind of respond. Is that okay? Go ahead. The middle here, the gentleman. Here.
Thank you for a very informative talk. Dan Roper from the Association of the United States Army. Could you talk a little bit more about the multipolar dimension of deterrence? You know, it's not just nuke in conventional space, cyber, and what's the integrating mechanism within the U.S. government? In theory, there's an NSS, National Security Strategy, and then a National Defense Strategy that kind of gets to it. What are your thoughts on that?
We'll go to Masashi too. I'll record them so that I can recall them for you too.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I'm Tsipora Fried. I'm now a senior visiting fellow at the Hudson, and I was a former senior advisor to the Vice Chief of the Joint Chief of Staff of the French Ministry of Army. I would like to come back to the failure and success of deterrence from both perspective, Russian and NATO. What do you think? Some say that finally NATO deterrence has worked, even though we see more and more reckless initiatives from Russia into NATO allies territories. Some say that, in fact, it's NATO deterrence that has worked because Russia never escalated, and the reverse is that we didn't want to push our operations on the ground in Ukraine because we were afraid of Russians' escalation and not bluffing about a tactical nuclear strike. So what do you think about those? Where is the failure? Where is the success? And where are we in terms of NATO's deterrence? A lot of allies question the United States' credibility on its nuclear umbrella.
Okay, we'll take last one as Masashi. I know, we will chat afterwards. Sorry about that. We'll just, Masashi, do you have one?
Thank you for your remarks and discussion. I'm Masashi Murano, the Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. In terms of the non-strategic capabilities, your report recommends expanding the production of the W76-2. As a Japanese, that I'm strongly agree with this direction. However, that increasing the deployment of low-yield warheads on Tridents would necessarily means greater share of the demerged or single warhead SLBMs, so which creates some kind of the trade-off with the measures to increase the number of deployed warheads through the uploading. So that so my question is that where do you see that appropriate balance between the single low yield SLBM and high capacity SLBMs? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we'll start off with China, Russia, the bipolar environment.
Right. This is a huge question. And it goes back to most of the deterrence theory and policy that we in the United States developed and thought we got right was really focused on a bipolar relationship. It just was. But why would, that's no surprise, it was a bipolar relationship. And so when Herman Kahn from the Hudson Institute and Thomas Schelling and others basically developed a deterrence theory, it was in the context of a bipolar relationship. And that was sort of the ground assumption for thinking about how deterrence would work and what deterrence would have to do, and the requirements for deterrence. What we've been thrust into is a context where we have to be able to deter multiple parties simultaneously. And to make it somewhat worse, or considerably worse, is that the multiple parties we have to deter simultaneously appear to be coalescing. I don't know the degree which there are formal alliances. Obviously, there's a formal alliance between Moscow and North Korea, and between China and Moscow. But what you see is what's been called the axis of upheaval. I tend not to like sort of silly names, but what we may be facing is a situation where the aggression we confront is not just from one party, but it's from multiple parties who are coordinating their aggression. Will that happen? I don't know whether that will happen. But what you do see is you see North Korean troops in Ukraine. In other words, you see some coordination going on that's very concerning. And so where does that take us? It takes us to the question of how do we not just deter one opponent and hopefully only have to deter them somehow sequentially? How do you deter multiple opponents simultaneously? And what are the requirements for that? It's a different calculation. It's a different measure of thinking, how do you meet your deterrence requirements? And as I said earlier, there are huge conventional non-nuclear force implications for that. On the nuclear side, it presents several really important questions. For example, do your nuclear forces need to only be able to target for deterrence purposes, to hold at risk for deterrence purposes, those assets in Russia and be limited to that number? Or do they need to be able to hold at risk for deterrence purposes assets in China and Russia simultaneously, and North Korea? In other words, how broad do you have to decide your deterrent threat has to play to provide an adequate deterrence? It's a much different world. And so folks who would like to keep the force numbers low tend to say you don't have to have the capability to deter all parties simultaneously. And I hope that's true. But we certainly don't know that that's the case. I mean, there's some probability that we need to be able to deter all parties simultaneously. And so the question is, what does the force structure look like for that particular mission? And it's, at least my conclusion, the conclusion of our study, is that the adequacy requirements to be able to do that are different from those that we were looking at in the past. And hence as I said, we're in the hole we're in.
The clock is deterring me from moving forward. So I will say this, the two questions that were asked are very rich, and I'm going to encourage all of you to take them for homework. I will answer on the one question because it's one of my pet sort of issues is clearly small d deterrence failed with Russia's act of aggression against Ukraine. Small d deterrence. I'm like, we tried, the administration tried through sanctions, and they had all these things. They thought they were integrated deterring them. Didn't work. But I would argue clearly strategic deterrence or big deterrence. There has not been an overt act of war, act of aggression against NATO ally or crossing a nuclear threshold, horizontal escalation. Now we can talk about some of the hybrid warfare that Russia's been engaging in. But that's not a reason to be lazy and to sort of assume, oh good, as long as you're a member of NATO, you're safe. That deterrence, I've learned this from Keith back when I was a very young whippersnapper Hill staffer. Deterrence is not passive, it's active. We must actively deter. It's an exercise. And so we must continue to do that to bolster the credibility of deterrence and make sure that peace continues to hold in the broad sense, and especially the nuclear peace, so that we have generations of Americans who can live in a world that is really where the United States is leading it and not the Chinese Communist Party and its axis of aggressors or upheaval. So with that, Keith,
Let me add just one.
please.
Just very shortly. I think that was.
He's not deterred.
No, I'm not. That was a great answer. Let me just add that. Remember what our deterrent is supposed to do. That's how you judge whether deterrence has failed or whether it's worked. And to answer the question, it has both failed and it has worked. Right? It's done both. So is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? The glass half full says Russia has not used nuclear weapons, either in a theater or in a strategic sense. So deterrence has worked. But what else is deterrence supposed to do? By our own statements, deterrence is supposed to prevent coercive threats. Deterrence is supposed to assure allies so that they don't feel the need for nuclear weapons. Deterrence is supposed to make sure that, for example, you don't see incursions into Estonian airspace by Russian aircraft, or incursions into Polish airspace by Russian drones, right? So at one level, deterrence has worked. Thank God, deterrence has worked at one level. But it looks like it's sort of nibbling away in terms of these gradual bits of failure. And what concerns me are the gradual bits of failure, because I don't know where they lead to. And in fact, in some ways, where they lead to, I think, depends on what we do in response. That's why I say it's prudent for us to respond so that we don't see deterrence fail more broadly than we've already seen.
With that, please, you can get your copy. I think we're all out of the physical copies here, but you can get it online as well. A new strategic review for a new age, 2025 National Institute for Public Policy. Dr. Keith Payne, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr.